I'm Gwendolyn Go, your desperate housewife who crafts. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to share some tips and tricks on ink blending using Distress inks and Alt New inks. In fact, I was just accepted into the Alt New Academy Educator Certification Program. And as I'm not very good at ink blending, I decided to take my first course by Amy Lee called Easy Ink Blending Techniques. So during the course, she advised us to make ink swatches, and so that is what I did. And if you're new to ink blending like me, I would highly recommend that you do ink swatches because I learned so much just by doing that. So to do ink blending, you need an ink blending tool, which I have in my right hand. I use the one from Ranger, and a sponge that goes onto the back of the blending tool with Velcro. In here I'm showing you how I store my sponges. I put them underneath the little cubes and they don't fall out even when you shake them. So, and then you just press onto the Velcro and use your sponge to blend onto paper, and when you're finished you just put them back and they don't fall off. So that's a really easy way to keep your sponges. For the bigger ink pads, I put the sponges underneath also, but using washi tapes to hold them in place. This is also a great way to use the washi tapes that you don't like. So the most important thing I learned during this course was the type of paper we need to use for ink blending. I now understand why I was so bad at ink blending before, because I was using the wrong paper. So one of the papers she suggests using is Canson watercolor paper, and I just so happen to have this paper on hand with me, so I use some of them to blend my inks. And as they have quite a grainy feel to them, they're not as smooth as the other paper I'm going to show you later. But when I created this swatch on this watercolor paper, I really liked the effect it gave, and it made me think of an underwater scene. And so in the future, if I need to create a underwater scene, I know which paper and which ink to use, which is one of the advantages of creating ink swatches. Isn't that beautiful how this Distress Oxide Twisted Citron goes onto the watercolor card? And I have to say that it's much easier to blend on watercolor paper, as I'll show you later on in the video. One of the other papers she suggested using was Neenah Solar White, but I only had Neenah Classic Crest, and that's what I used, and it worked really well too. It's a much smoother paper than the watercolor paper, but the ink goes on like butter, and even though it's a bit more difficult to blend than on watercolor paper, my learning curve was less steep than when I blended on normal paper. Now I just wanted to share something with you I found out while doing ink swatches, that I have the Distress ink and the Distress Oxide, and they are not exactly the same color. So this is with the Distress ink and this is with the Distress Oxide ink, both of them on Neenah Classic Crest smooth paper. And you can see that the Distress ink on the right is a bit more pinker than the one on the left. Well, just something I wanted to share with you. Now I'm going to show you a very close-up side view of how I do ink blending. Now I'm not an expert yet, but after about 20 ink swatches, I wanted to share with you what I learned. The first thing I learned was that the type of paper made a difference on how I blended the inks. Using a smoother paper like Neenah Classic Crest, I have to go on softer with the inks in the beginning. So after I put the sponge onto the ink pad to get ink, you see that I stamp onto the side to get rid of some excess inks, because if I have too much ink on the sponge, then I found out that I left streaks or circles onto my paper. You also see that I'm always tilting the ink blending tool either to the left or the right, and I'm blending in circular motions. This is also to avoid any streaks and marks when I'm blending. But once you have some ink down onto the paper, then you can stop tilting your tool too much and use the whole sponge like I'm doing here, but always gently and softly, not too much, not pressing down with too much pressure onto the paper with my ink blending tool. Oh, by the way, excuse my bandaged finger, but I just bought a really good knife and I was using it this morning, and it was found out how good it was because it cut right through my nail to the skin underneath. Ouch. So anyway, back to my ink blending. Doing these swatches, as I said, was so helpful for me because not only did I find out the different ways the ink reacted onto smooth paper or onto watercolor paper. Obviously, my ink blending skills got much better after each swatch. So this, as I told you, is like the 20th time I'm creating an ink swatch. And the very first one was the pink distress inks I showed you earlier. Those were my first ones. And those were really blotchy and spotchy, as you must have noticed. So I wanted to show that after 20 ink swatches, my technique and my ink blending skills became much better. Look at that. Not so much as a stain or a splotch. I'm really proud. So now I'm going to show you what it looks like when you're blending on watercolor paper. You'll see that blending with watercolor paper is so much easier than blending on a smooth card stock, and it goes on so smoothly. As you can see, I'm not stamping the excess ink onto the side. I'm not really tilting my ink blending tool. I'm just going for it. I'm pressing down pretty hard, and it does not leave any splotches or any streaks at all. So it's so much easier to blend on watercolor cards. Another tip that I'd like to share with you is that when you're ink blending, you should hold down your paper as close to where you're blending your ink as much as possible. Then your paper won't bend. Look, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that blending beautiful? And it was so much quicker than blending on smooth paper. Now let's see, compare both cards. You'll see that it's different. The color is a bit different. On the smoother paper, the color is more intense. And that's the Neenah Classic, and that's the watercolor paper. So on the left, it's more intense. On the right, it's a bit more chalky. But I would suggest for beginners to start out with watercolor paper. This is another example with Broken China. On the left, it's with Neenah Classic Crest, and on the right with watercolor paper. The texture is really different. So, and especially with distress inks, I think they don't cover watercolor paper as much. So after I did all my ink swatches, I put them on a piece of paper and put them up on my board. And now I have a quick reference when I'm looking for colors to blend, to see the effect and to see if they will match with whatever I'm stamping, whatever colors I'm stamping with. Well, I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching, and come back soon. Bye!